Today's December 4th, 1974, and I'm interviewing Rabbi Harold Saperstein in Lynbrook, New York.
I was in the services as a chaplain between 1943 and 1946. My first overseas appointment was in Italy, not far from Caserta, which itself is near Naples. Later on, I moved up to the Rome area, was in Pontinia, a little town in the marshes south of Rome, and immediately after the liberation of Rome, I had the opportunity of going into Rome and going through the ghetto area. In this respect, there was really nothing that I did for Jews excepting to have the morale influence of seeing someone come in with the Star of David painted on his Jeep, the word chaplain between, the people crowded out into the streets, held up their babies for me to bless. There's a great deal of acculturation. They take over the patterns of the surrounding Catholic population and reach for my hand to kiss my ring, that being the pattern that they have seen among their non-Jewish neighbors. After my Italian army experience, we came into France in the South French invasion. I think it was in August of 44. And we moved on up through various towns. There were very few Jews in these towns, although in some there was an unused synagogue, which I, in each case, would convert and utilize for my services. The first occasion where I came in touch with any group of Jews was in the town of Grenoble in the French Alps. It's a famous skiing resort and university town now. And I was there for the High Holy Days of 1944. I found there a very interesting group. There was a woman, she was probably in her late 30s at the time, whose name was Jean Lachiver, and she had gathered together a group of about 20 or more young people, most of them in their late teens. Their parents had left the country, but they had remained behind voluntarily in order to render whatever service they could to remaining Jews. They had false documents identifying them as non-Jews, and they had access to somebody in the municipality who would give them additional false documents if they were able to assist other Jews with whom they made contact. Their chief function was in keeping contact with scattered Jews who were hidden in farms throughout the area. It is something of an agricultural area. Jews who had come down from the north, largely from Paris, those who had enough money were able to buy their way into places of hiding, and the area was saturated with Jews who were secretly being held by local farmers, and they were able to carry news from one to the other and to preserve the contact. Occasionally they would venture on taking groups of children, apparently on an outing. They pretended to be youth leaders, and they'd go away singing in the train to the Swiss border, which is not very far, and then have the children sent over the Swiss border, and they were able to save some dozens of children in that way. Once or twice they got in the difficulty because the Nazis had the practice of suddenly closing a road and then stopping everybody caught within that road and giving them a physical examination. If you were a male and were circumcised, you would be in trouble examining your identification papers. As an afterthought, about some 10 years ago, I was in Israel, and the local paper listed the fact that I was among the quotation marks distinguished visitors. And a group of these people had gone to Israel, and Jean Lachiver and some of the others noticed it, didn't know where I was, but called every hotel in Jerusalem till they found me, and then arranged a reunion of these people who were scattered all over Israel. They all came together. She is living now in an apartment in Jaffa, and it was quite a memorable and moving occasion to meet them again. The majority of them, I would say 4/5 of those who were with us, are now settled in various parts of Israel. I conducted the High Holy Day services in Grenoble that year. I had set aside a requisition, the use of the auditorium of the university. There were several GI units, both the one that I was with, which was the second replacement depot, which in France had supported the Fifth Army, but in Italy it supported the Fifth Army, but in France was supporting the Seventh Army. And we put out notices about the service so that all those in various units could see it, and expected a fairly good crowd. When we came to the service, however, we found the hall was already filled with 800 civilians, non-army men, French civilians. By the mysterious underground that got around, they had learned that there was a service, and they had come early and filled the place, so that I had to have two services. Fortunately, I had found in the meantime a French army chaplain, who incidentally all through the years of the war was being paid by the Vichy government for his services. He was in one of the towns in the Alsace-Lorraine area, and the French government apparently paid its clergymen their salaries at the time, and he was being paid by them. But he had been in the underground in the Free French movement, and now found himself in Grenoble, and so he worked together with me and was able to carry on the service and do the preaching. And then I conducted my service, and it was again a filled auditorium, but a number of civilians had waited over for the American service. I had a young girl from this group under Gina Lachiver. Her last name was Einhorn, can't remember the first name, who knew English quite well, and she translated my sermon into French so that people would be able to understand what I was saying. There were several. Grenoble had a number of intellectuals there, and there were several freedom rallies commemorating the liberation of France and representing a memorial tribute to those who had died. In each case, I was asked to be one of the speakers. Unfortunately, my Yiddish, which would have been the lingua franca, we might say, the one that everybody would have understood, is not quite adequate to public address, although I can understand ordinary conversation. I was speaking about these freedom rallies, and I would of necessity speak in English, and each time there was a translator who would translate into French. Fortunately, words like democracy and liberty are universally understood, and they elicited a very important response. I think that the main value of my being there was not that I helped in their work, but I gave them the feeling that they were not alone, a feeling that they had through all the years of their struggle. But I consider this group of young people to be one of they're ordinary kids, but one of the bravest groups that I've met over the years.
They didn't ask you to do anything for them other than...
Just they wanted me to join with them. Now, of course, liberation had come, and we were able to meet together freely, and the feeling that American Jewry stood with them. There was no need at this time. They were a very self-contained and independent group, and so there's nothing that I could do. And yet I feel they still talk about how much I did for them, whereas in my mind I did nothing but admire them.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that I was there as a representative, first of organized Jewry, and second of the American Jewish community, and that I was able to speak at occasions when they gathered together formally and so on, to them represented a great deal, even though in my mind I was the recipient of the inspiration rather than the source of inspiration. Now, from Grenoble we went on to Epinal. Epinal is in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains as you go on into the Alsace-Lorraine area. There'd been some heavy fighting up there in the nearby Vosges Mountains, but our headquarters was in a suburb of Epinal, an industrial suburb called Tillon, but it was only a couple of miles from Epinal, and I came back to Epinal on many, many occasions. Epinal still had a Jewish community. I would guess that there may have been about 60 families who I found there. Some of them had been intermarried and for various reasons had been able to survive, not ostentatiously, but still to survive. And others had been in various other places in hiding and had now returned. Whenever there was no rabbi in the community, many of the people were old. A great number had been in Drancy, which was the French concentration camp for those who had been largely in Paris but other parts of France and had come out. And there were several deaths during the period that I was there, 3 or 4. In each case, they called upon me to perform the services. Perhaps the outstanding experience that I remember there came during the springtime when Purim came, and I decided to have a Purim party, not only primarily for the men in the armed forces, and I always served. I continued with the 2nd Replacement Depot, but since there were many Jewish units around that had no chaplains, I would serve them often at periodic intervals and get word to them of things that we had done. And we decided to invite the local children, the Jewish children, and any non-Jewish children who want to come along. In each case, the children were delighted to be able to be the hosts once again and to invite other children. We took over the assembly hall at the city hall, and when it came time for our program, the mayor and other city officials were there. However, the program itself was kind of unique. I'd written a number of skits, farce skits in the Purim spirit, and I found that in my outfit we had a number of people who were ideally equipped. Some of them had been professional actors. One had been a comedian in a burlesque circuit and so on. And he knew the technique of the pratfall, of falling, without hurting himself, but in a ludicrous fashion. And I had him take the role of Hitler. And as we, in one of the skits, the opening skit, and as we started, suddenly I felt a great feeling of uncertainty. There was not a family here which had not lost at least one member of the family under the Nazis. And here I was burlesquing it for laughs. And I hadn't thought of it in writing it because I was thinking of the Purim spirit. But now the feeling of the appropriateness of this kind of activity bothered me. Perhaps it would be considered in bad taste. But at any rate, it was too late to do anything about it. And the thing began, and the man playing Hitler came on stage dressed up. We had captured Nazi uniforms. We had everything so that he looked the part. He had a raincoat on and a mustache on and his makeup and so on. He came on, just got on stage and did one of his pratfalls. He tripped on his own feet and went bang flat And there was a moment of hushed silence, and my heart did a flip-flop. I said, oh my God, what have I done? And then there was a storm of laughter that came out. There was a release. Suddenly these people realized that they could laugh at the people who had been the menace to them and the source of their tragedy. And from then on, the program was made. It was all in English. The majority of them didn't understand it, but it was obvious enough. I had a dozen different skits. Each one was sort of burlesqued in the sense of bringing out the funny parts of it. And it was a magnificent success, plus the fact that from GI sources I got things like oranges and ice cream and so on, which they had not had for years, and so it made a very special treat. And it was a memorable occasion for all of us. And I met with the people in the Jewish community on various occasions, individually and in groups, and tried to advise them and counsel them. Eventually many of them returned to their homes in France, and there probably still is a small Jewish community remaining there with the synagogue. Now, from Epinal, I moved on into Worms in Germany. Now, in Worms in Germany, there were no survivors. The last 5 Jews in Worms who had been intermarried, and Mishaea, intermarriage, made it a little bit easier to survive as long as you stayed, not necessarily in hiding, but undercover and didn't go around freely. However, the day or 2 days before the Americans came, when the capture of the city was quite imminent, the Nazis, before leaving, had taken out these last 5 Jews and shot them. So there was nothing left. All that we had left were the remains of the famous synagogue. It had been the oldest synagogue in Europe, built in the year 1213. Or was it 1234? I'm not sure now. It remained with minor changes through all these years. The mikveh, the ancient medieval mikveh, was there. I was instrumental. This is not important in this context, but I was instrumental in salvaging some of the treasures of the Worms Jewish community, including the famous Worms Machzer, which had been written in the year 1272, the oldest existed, naturally, a manuscript Machzer in the world, and it is now in the library at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Incidentally, the story is told in a little book that I have back here called God's Warriors. I don't have it right handy at the moment, by Bill Elkins of Rochester. It just came out a month or 2 ago, and he wrote that. And some of the stories that I'm telling you are also included in the book put out by the Jewish Welfare Board a couple of years ago. I forget the title of it.
Rabbis in Uniform?
Rabbis in Uniform. They have about 3 stories dealing with some of my experiences there. And just of passing interest, for example, since travel and the historical aspect of travel has been a kind of avocation for me over the years, I set up a service of sightseeing tours in Worms to the non-Jewish as well as the Jewish historical sites, but concentrating on the Jewish. And over a period of about 6 weeks, in which I did this every day, I brought literally many thousands of GIs around to the site of the ancient synagogue, to the cemetery which goes back to the 11th century, to other places that had some association with the Jewish community. However, from Worms, I took occasion to go up to places like Frankfurt and others, visiting places of Jewish interest, but also in Frankfurt there were a group of survivors who at this time now were in a hotel in Frankfurt which had been available for them, and they were marking time. The painful thing was that at this time the rules of non-fraternization, that is, the prohibition of American soldiers from having anything to do with German civilians, were still in force. And by a strange blindness or perversion of thinking, Jewish refugees were included in the category of those to whom the non-fraternization laws applied. I did take opportunity of bringing various supplies, since as yet the JDC, which was poised on the borders with supplies and personnel, was being held out by military decree and prevented from coming in. And so, since I had access to the quartermaster department through some of my men, I was able to get supplies of needed materials which were not yet available to them, and to bring them up to these groups.
Excuse me for 1 second. Do you remember exactly when this was? When you went to Frankfurt?
Yes, this was just a week or so after the Germans had been driven out of Frankfurt, and it must have been in the, just after Pesach at that time. I remember because my last big public service had been in Epinal for Pesach, and then right after that we went on, and that too was quite an experience. I had hundreds and hundreds of men from all over. We took over. We found a dump where the Germans had left behind vast supplies of kitchen utensils, and I managed to get them and carted them down so that we could serve about 400 or 500 men. And we had quite a magnificent Seder at that time in a large hall in Epinal. Then we went on into Germany. It was kind of a satisfying feeling to drive through town after town and see the white flags of surrender hanging from every window at every house, because the feeling of surrender was still there. Later on it dissipated, although the people looked at you with hatred in their eyes. And when I went up to Frankfurt, which was the headquarters of the 7th Army, and General Lucius B. Clay, who later on did a very magnificent job in terms of his relationship with refugees after the war was over, but at that time was the commanding general of the army, of the 7th Army, which had fought its way into Germany, had his headquarters there, and one of the famous, I guess it was a Krupp Works or something of that kind in Frankfurt, I forget the name, but one of the great industrial concerns they'd taken over for
the I.G. Farben building?
Might have been the I.T. Farben building. I.G. Farben, yeah. I didn't make specific records of these things, and they become a little confused in my mind. At any rate, it seemed such a blatant injustice to say. As I was saying, I felt the obvious injustice of placing the victims of the Nazis in the same category as the Nazis themselves. And so I took it upon myself. I was then a captain. Later I became a major before I got out of the service. But took it upon myself to go and make an official report, an official request that these laws should be changed. I came up to the offices of General Clay, asked the sergeant who was on duty at the door if I could see somebody from the civilian affairs department there, and he said yes, got on the telephone, and came back to me and said, General Clay will see you in 5 minutes. I had had no idea that I would come into the presence of the top man. I thought I'd get to some major or colonel or something, but there I was there. I hadn't prepared any brief or anything. I just had a deep emotion about it.
Do you remember when this meeting took place?
Yes, it was in the spring, the late spring of 1945. It might have been in April or May of 1945.
More specific than that, you don't remember?
I really can't. I really should be able to for historical reasons, but I'm afraid I can't. I might later. I have still someplace a batch of letters that I sent to my wife day after day. I've never reread them, but she kept them. And one of these days I may go through and arrange them in order. They're in a big shoebox, arrange them in order, and I may have had some reference to this visit there. I incidentally wrote a report of this to Stephen Wise, who was my teacher, and who was a man who had ordained and married me, and I wrote a detailed report of the visit to him, and I'm sure it must be someplace in his files there.
Okay.
At any rate, I found myself, came into the headquarters room, and General Clay was there, another general was there, and a corporal. I want to say that General Clay at that time was very friendly, receptive to my coming. There was no formalities about what do you want, why are you bothering us. But at that time, and this I think is a very interesting observation of the role of even an intelligent and sympathetic non-Jew, completely unaware of the significance of the problem that I was trying to present to him. In other words, the Jewish problem, which to us as Jewish men was central in our concern in fighting the Nazis, was not at all a factor in the minds of the military. For example, I can recall very clearly, I asked him, why can't the JDC, which is trained for handling this kind of thing, and has been waiting for this opportunity, and are poised with their supplies and personnel, come in to meet the needs of Jewish survivors? And he answered, if we let the Jews come in, then we would have to let Catholic groups come in and Protestant groups come in, and there would be a great deal of confusion, and so we have got to first handle the completion of our role here of military occupation, and then we will be able to open the doors. But while there were Catholic and Protestant victims of Nazis, the fact that the Jews were the prime central victim in both numbers and extent never apparently had entered his mind. He was well-meaning. It wasn't anti-Semitism. It was just, I felt a lack of understanding here.
Do you think that American Jewry was mistaken in not educating the Americans about this, and particularly the Army?
I imagine that we could have done considerably more in that respect. I think that we felt somehow that there was a community of interest that people, but there is another factor to it, and it is a painful factor to recognize, that when it hurts you, other people don't feel the pain who represent different groups. And there had been by that time ample evidence in the papers of the suffering of the Jews and so on. But somehow the association between the fact that Jews were the prime sufferers at the hands of the Nazis and the concomitant result that therefore in carrying on the occupation of the land we should hurry to ease the burden for the Jews, that never entered the minds of the non-Jew. So it wasn't simply, we perhaps could have done more of awareness all through those years. I remember even in Italy going into hospitals where there were German Nazi soldier patients there. And my emotions, they were lying in their beds and I was bitter, and the non-Jews, the Jewish medical officers could understand my feelings, but the non-Jews couldn't understand it. Or in other places when we first came into Germany in Worms, and the non-Jewish chaplains, as I did, would take their jeeps and drive around the countryside, and I would speak and they would talk about, these people are just like us. They're hard working, they keep their farms so beautifully. And I would try to tell them, but don't you realize what has been done? These people stood by And despite the fact that they say that they didn't know, they said Heil Hitler like crazy as long as he was on top of the world. And they would look at me with a kind of condescension by saying, oh, you're emotionally involved, you're prejudiced, you don't see things objectively. To them, the Germans were an enemy because they were on the other side of the war, but there was no emotional involvement in respect to this. To the average American, several of these non-Jewish chaplains were from the Midwest and so on, and Jewish concerns just didn't touch them in the heart or where it meant anything. Come back to General Clay. I try to explain, but these people are the victims there. They weren't the perpetrators of injustice or the people who made the threat to America. And he still continued. He said, the American army cannot distinguish between Jews and Catholics and Protestants. This would be contrary to our principles. See, there was a kind of a perversion of the American ideal of religious equality here, which here was totally unrealistic, but still. The conversation went on, and someplace in my files, unfortunately, I am not a writing man, and I've had many experiences over the years, which I wish I could remember in detail. I have a somewhat more specific description of this someplace in my files, which I haven't been able to look up. But the conversation went on. Then finally, after you've gotten these answers, and you want very much to respond, you're still a captain, and he's a general, and when it's time to leave, you don't come back there. You're sort of churning inside and you salute and you say, thank you, sir, and you turn around and leave. This is what the Army sort of demands from you in the accepted protocol of Army relationships, and RHIP rank has its privileges and so on. So the thing that bothers me is that there had been no political preparation on the part of the Jewish community at that time for preparing for the advance into Germany. Perhaps it's unrealistic to expect it. It may be that the problem was too complex and we never have this experience. But it would seem to me that there should have been the kind of political preparation that would have enabled them to move immediately there.
You never asked Rabbi Wise about that?
Pardon?
You never asked Rabbi Wise about that?
No, I never did. I suppose I should have, but it was some months after that. By the time I got home, I saw him, but I never did. From Worms, which was a really fascinating experience, our unit, the 2nd Replacement Depot, during the fighting, we had been a combat replacement depot. We kept right behind the advanced lines to supply combat replacements to the combat units. As the casualties came each day, they needed 10 riflemen, 2 cooks, this, that, so on. We would send them on. Now we came back and they reversed our function, and we were now processing people. It was after the E-Day. We were processing people who were going out through the port of Antwerp. I think they called it Camp High Hat, and we were in Namur, which is about 30 miles the other side of Brussels. Here I found another very fascinating group. There was a Catholic priest whose name was Vicar André, and he was one, in my mind, of the Tzadikei Umot HaOlam, the righteous of the non-Jewish peoples of the world, and he had dedicated his life during those years to saving Jews. Many of them were Belgian Jews who had come down from Brussels and Antwerp and found refuge in Namur. He had the cooperation of people in his congregation, in his parish. One of them was a director of the local mental institution, an insane asylum, and in some cases where it was necessary temporarily, Jews had been put in as patients into the institution and held over until they could then be sent out, and they were given homes. In various individuals were willing to take the risk, and the priest, the vicar, had a large home with a large rooming annex there, and he took 20 to 30 people, mostly young people, teenagers. Some of them had come there from Poland now. It was after the E-Day, but he had given them, and some he had kept all through the years of the war. For almost 3 years he had not slept in his own bed. He had given it over to a Jew, and he gathered food from his own people. I took the opportunity when I came in of cooperating with him, and from now on providing food, which I brought in each day from the leftovers of our mess, and clothing articles. Pretty soon the young people looked like GIs. They had all cast off GI uniforms, you know, as they're going along. And then we did a number of interesting things. First of all, I conducted the High Holy Day services in a hall in Namur, and then conducted special services for the cycle of autumn holidays, Sukkot and Simchat Torah, in the courtyard of the vicar. He didn't have a church that he served. He was a kind of administrative person, and they had a large building there in the courtyard, and we built the sukkah. And this in itself was a kind of a therapeutic experience for the young people. I got a couple of jeeps, and I took out 8 young people with proper tools into the woods, and we cut down the schach. We cut down branches from the trees and loaded it into the jeeps. And we came back and we built a massive sukkah in the courtyard of the priest's place. And we had a big party, and here again, now particularly there were more non-Jews than Jews, because the vicar had all the non-Jewish kids of his parish together, and we had a service and a little program, and I brought in special supplies that had come. We had continuously fruit and equipment for making ice cream and so on, and we brought these things in so that these people who for years had been the recipients of the largesse and the sacrifice of the surrounding people now felt that they were the hosts, and they could invite other people in. They were quite memorable occasions. Eventually I was able to take this group of children and bring them to Brussels, where there was now an organized institution.
Orphanages?
And no, we brought them to a temporary residence in an orphanage on way to Israel. They were going to Israel. As we drove away...
Do you remember when this took place?
Yeah, this was in the summer, probably around August or September. No, later. It was after Passover. It was in probably September to the beginning of October of 1945.
How many people did you?
I would say that there must have been 30 children whom we took from there, and some people who were not children, related to some of the children. Some of them were Belgium, and some of them were from Eastern Europe. His place had become a kind of a mecca. They had heard about it and concentrated on it. Incidentally, it was right under the nose of the Gestapo. The Gestapo had the hotel, which was next door to his building, and he carried it on at great risk to his life. Once or twice they tried to find him, and he had got word from people who passed word on to him and escaped. Simple, unpretentious, humble man, one of the great heroes that I've met in my life. And despite the fact that it is sometimes stated that priests who tried to save Jewish children did so for the purpose of ultimate conversion, he cannot be charged with that objective. He made every effort to assist the youngsters in observing Jewish practices and maintaining their own faith. and he welcomed me. Some other chaplains who came into the area at times were suspicious of him and showed their suspicion and kind of alienated the possibility of any relationship with him. I accepted him and found him to be honest and trustworthy. And we brought these kids into the bus, and we got 2 army buses and drove into Brussels. Eventually they were sent to Israel and are now scattered through Israel. The moment of parting was a very moving thing. We were singing songs, and they were singing Was mir seinen mir, aber jeden seinen mir. And the priest stood in the road, the tears streaming down his face, offering his hands upheld in blessing to the kids, and the kids were looking back, and some of them were weeping. He had been a real father to them, incidentally, through a recommendation in part that I had made through, not a recommendation actually, but I wrote a story of this in that book that you mentioned before, the JWB book.
Rabbis in Uniform.
Yes, Rabbis in Uniform. I wrote up this story, and I imagine, in part as a result of that, 3 or 4 years ago, the UJA brought him to America with 3 other people to give a humanitarian award to him. And when he got the call, the call went to Brussels to Namur, he said he has only one request, and that is that I should be informed about it. I was, in fact, I got a call from Brussels from somebody whom he had asked to call me to tell me that he was coming. He was out here one Friday night and made a tremendous, he didn't speak any English, but just the simplicity of the man made a tremendous impression upon our people. And I understand he did other humanitarian work. He took in Hungarian refugees later, using his time. They made him the chaplain of the jail in Namur there for some years. But he died, from word that I've had. He was not good at correspondence, and so we didn't keep up. He wrote several times. I visited him once when my boys, both of whom are now rabbis, but when they were very young with my wife and boys, and a report of that was given in one of the local newspapers there in French, and a picture of us being together. But someplace I have a picture of a group of these young people and myself and the vicar together that was taken. That picture was given to me as a farewell gift when they came together. We had a farewell kind of supper before I left at the time. Now, near Namur, there was a little group of young people who were in Shomer HaTzair and were preparing for Aliyah. They were a completely different kind of group. They were self-reliant. They had a kind of farm that they'd taken over. They were working, and I brought them a considerable amount of supplies. I must say that, and I can't say this off the record because it's on the tape, but I wouldn't want it publicized, that some of the supplies that I brought were sold on the black market. They needed money more than they needed a particular kind of supplies, because once or twice when I came with a jeep load of equipment, a neighboring farmer would drive up and would say to them, "I understand that you have American goods, and I know enough French to understand it," and they would hush him up and push him away, But I brought them so much so that for a time our G2, our intelligence units got them, and the MPs, the military, not the intelligence units, the military police, got on my trail. They thought that I was selling stuff on the black market because I would use various resources to load the thing with material, blankets and other items that I thought, the kitchen items, other items I thought could be used, and I would drive away with it. And when I'd done this half a dozen times, they thought that I was carrying on a black market operation. They trailed me one time, and then finally I had to explain that I was helping this group. I got them a few. They were very anxious to get guns, and some of our...
Well, that's an interesting story, and I want to make sure we have the tape. Yeah, fine.
All right. Now, some of our officers had developed a hobby of collecting guns. They would go around, not being a gun enthusiast, I don't know the names, but there were Lugers and Berettas and other kinds of guns that they'd picked up from the various armies and from German officers who had the same hobby, and it was sort of a goal to have as many different kinds, and particularly rare kinds of guns as you had. And I went around to several and picked up the guns that they were willing to part with, and I brought various guns to them. They wanted them for practice, just for coming into Israel. This group was different psychologically from the others. They already had an Israeli outlook. They didn't feel that they were the recipients of, philanthropy when you brought them something. To them, this was your duty to help them. They were above saying thank you for anything. They already had the pattern there. They did whatever, but they were a very self-reliant group and deserved a great deal of credit. And eventually, I'm sure they all came into Israel. In the meantime, in Brussels, I made many visits to orphan homes. There was one young woman there. Her name was Jean de Man, and Jean de Man was another